in a 4-hour New Orleans drum session does not have time to figure out your freaking splash or whatever. There you need to balance your playing and make sure it sounds good, even if you just record the drums with a Decca tree or some sort of overhead. Of course, metal is different, and that's also why we are getting more and more into this thing where people just give up and sample everything and record an overhead, or even sample the cymbals. But in any case, what I usually do to be able to quickly move around between different methods is that I flip the head, turn the head like 90 degrees or so, maybe like that, because that way it's easier to get in to the kick drum and still have a good balance on the stand. Something we also need to figure out here is how much dampening we want in the kick. I usually think there should be some, but I absolutely do not think that it should be filled with various types of foam or whatever. In this kick drum right now was this, which is like a purpose-made kind of cushion for kicks, which can be really fine. The only thing is that I want to put like an SM91 pressure zone microphone in there. It's going to be a little tricky to put it on this one, so I usually prefer just some sort of towel or something to get a little bit more resonance out of the kick, depending on the music I'm recording as well. But in this music, in this song, it's going to be paced for having a little bit more of length in the kick. So then I want to be able to control that. So I'm simply using a regular towel, put it in and try to like position it just so it touches the front and batter head. Inspect, especially if there's someone coming in with new drums, just visually inspect that we have a good edge. When I tune a drum, I usually try to think that the bottom head needs to be either sort of equal or higher on the low side. I would usually try to find something where the batter head lives well, where I like it, and then I use the bottom head to like adjust the overall tone sensation for up and down. So a little bit more pragmatic approach to it. And then we put the rim back. It can be a really good idea to put some sort of tape to lock the screws. It's not so important on toms because you don't hit rim shots on toms. Sometimes it can be an idea to put it where you are in risk of hitting the rim shot, depending on how the tom is situated. For snare, you can see here already on this old head that we're gonna replace that there is a tape here, and that's plumber's tape. It's like a Teflon tape. I'm sure there's the equivalent all around the globe for these. I just buy them at the local hardware store. It's like a super thin tape that you put around the threads of the screw, and it's thin enough to actually just, without a problem, follow down into the hole. And that way, the screw does not rotate very easily anymore. Can be a little bit unusual to tune with that in, but once it's in tune, once it's nice, it holds so much better than any of the lug locks that I've tried. I usually keep some sort of lug locks as well, just so I can see whether it moved or not. And then you have the factor of the head getting worn out, so you're gonna have to adjust that, of course. But it is a really good system that saves a lot of back and forth into the studio. Plumber's tape, it's a good tip. It's a lot about practicing these things. It's a really good thing. If you're gonna engineer or produce, you should have some knowledge, or should I say experience in this field. Those productions where the drum tech or the drummer is better than you, that's great. If they can handle that themselves, it's fantastic. I've worked with some of those drummers like Krim. He tunes his kit himself. Great matter. Eloy from Sepultura, Bruno from Angra. Those are like trained growing up with drums, also knowing how to tune their kits, and that's fantastic that they know how it responds. But most of the time, especially when you work with shitty local bands, if I'm allowed to say so, that's where you need to step in and be better than them. Just do it, practice. You're gonna be extremely frustrated because one day you think, I'm the best tuner in the world, and then the next day it's like, oh shit, I suck at this. Sometimes it could be stuff like take the head off again. It could be a bad head. If you start listening to heads, don't do that. It will be expensive, I promise you. You will hear that they are all different. I know some drum engineers and drum techs like Jakob Herrmann. He actually goes down to the music store and drives them crazy while listening for heads, and then I'm gonna buy these. Leave the shitty ones to others. The trick that I've been using with this plumber's tape is a great one. I can really recommend it, but there could be drawbacks. So sometimes I've had a rental and then I would get an invoice because they had to spend hours cleaning out those screw housings or tuning housings. As soon as we are wrapped up with putting the new heads on, we're gonna set the kit up and do the fine-tuning before putting mics on. Let's start with the kick drum. I have 4 microphones on the kick. One is actually built in this model, like factory built in, which is like a D112 style microphone. I have also placed an SM91 pressure zone microphone pretty much in the center of the kick. In the resonance hole, I have just a B52 Shure microphone, pretty standard for kicks. I've used it a lot and I like it. And outside here, I have a Neumann U47 FET, which is like the tubeless version of the U47. And that's also a classic for kick out. It has a pretty beefy, nice sound that can be blended in. So between those microphones, I have a lot of playroom, so to speak, between pretty clicky sound from the pressure zone microphone that is in there. That also has a pretty nice snappy low end to it if I want to use that. The B52 is a really like pre-EQ'd, very meaty kind of fat sounding microphone. U47, a little more round with a nice little crack to it usually when you put it on the kick. And the D112 is going to be the wild card microphone in this one. There are some things to think about here, like for example, how do you place a pressure zone microphone in there without the cable being a problem coming out of the kick. So what I usually do, I take this really thin leader that is standard for the SM91 that goes to the preamp. Then I have taped it to my B52 like this in order for it to not start making noises from the hole in the front head. Another like basic thing when placing those microphones is to make sure that there's also always a security like distance between any stand and any drum. Because if you don't, you will end up with low frequency noises going up into the cymbal microphones. It also needs a little bit of wiggle room here, because if a drummer plays the kit, there's always a chance of stuff starting to move a little bit. So things need to be able to move a little bit before it creates a problem. And then I would go in here every once in a while and make sure that things are in order. Snare drum. There are a few things to think about while placing microphones on the snare drum. Usually my main concern is to make sure that there's no risk of any toms or anything touching the microphones, but also what else are the microphones gonna pick up. Let's say if I have the hi-hat here, I would try to avoid coming with microphones from here because it would be, a high amount of hi-hat into the snare mics. I would also try to avoid coming too much from here because if I normally, now he has his ride really high up, but if the ride would be here, it would also be an issue. Depending on the situation, I could also try to screen off the microphones a little bit. There are some drawbacks to the tone and high end of the snare by doing so, in my experience. So I would probably start without it. One pretty common trick is to use like a mouse mat kind of configuration that you put here. And I'm sure there are also some solutions and products out there for this purpose. Just remember that anything you put there could also potentially be like a comp filtering. In this case, we have a good balanced drummer and we have quite a good distance to the hi-hat. So I'm gonna try without any gimmicks to start with at least. So top microphone, I have 2 versions of the SM57. It's an old 545 Unidyne 3 and we have a Shure, little more modern SM57 here. So I'm gonna try them both, see what I like. Maybe it will be a combination or maybe I will ditch one of them, we'll see. I usually prefer to go dynamic, and from all the mics I've tried, I always come back to these microphones. Maybe it's just because I'm fucking old. Another thing that I try to be careful about is the distance. Like here on the 57, you can see that I try to put the microphone in over the edge of the snare drum a little bit, because the mic also has a pretty good pickup around here in this space. So try to get it a little bit in. And then the angle, but this is usually my starting point, trying to angle it somewhere pretty close to the center, maybe a little bit over here. You could also get different results if you angle it heavily towards the rim or try to be very much in the center. From my experience, comparing or sort of getting the best result between bleed and tone of the snare, this is usually my starting point. This one is not fully aligned yet. I'm gonna fix this a little bit, trying to get them as equal as possible in phase. If I would see in my DAW, when we do the sound check, that there is a slight timing difference between those, I would probably try to readjust accordingly. One thing to think about is if you do use like a hyper cardioid microphone, there is some sort of pattern pickup in the treble just behind the microphone as well. That's also a reason why I probably would usually try to avoid putting it like this, because then you would have a hi-hat pickup straight from the back of the microphone. It's just the way of the physics of those capsules. Underneath, I have a Beta 57 that I think complements the frequency response of the SM57 in a really nice way. I do not like it much as a guitar microphone or top snare, but for bottom, for some reason, it just really works for me. I also have a contender. Underneath is a Milab VM41, and it's a condenser microphone, small membrane kind of thing, which is also pretty popular for snare side miking. And I could end up using them in combination. I could even end up using them for different parts in the song, depending on what I'm going for. But mostly right now it's to figure out which one I think fits our session the best, and then I might ditch the other one. And about the placement of those, you can see that I've taped them together simply because trying to avoid fitting two stands underneath. And I usually try to resemble the angle and distance of the top microphones. That way it's easier to get them in good phase with each other, and I sort of like it. If I do end up wanting like more of the actual snares here, then I might place it a little bit closer to the center. Sometimes I would go a little further, especially if it's like a 5-inch or something, a little thinner snare, then I might increase the distance a little bit. But for a 6.5-inch or even deeper, then I would go about as close to the bottom head as I have the top mics from the top head. One thing that I would also normally do is phase flip these on the preamps already on the input. Okay, so let's look at the toms. Extremely standard, I would say, almost embarrassingly standard. MD421s, angled the way I like it. You can see that it resembles the snare. If I would feel that I'm not completely happy with what I'm getting from this, I might put on something underneath as well, and that will usually be like a SM57 or something. My starting point here is a UM70 from Microtech FL. It has the same capsule as many Neumann microphones. They used to be the same company as Neumann. It's a brilliant condenser microphone that I tend to use for a little bit of everything, really. It's a really good hi-hat microphone. So we start with that. My option for that could be maybe a KM84 or something, even an SM81. When it comes to positioning of the microphone, I have some theories or some experience on the matter. I personally think that the hi-hat sounds maybe the best when it's like pretty far from and pretty angled towards the side of the hi-hat. Not too much, because then you would get actual wind blowing into the microphone, but just above it, like here, would be the silkiest, nicest, sweetest hi-hat sound. The more you get up here, the grittier it gets. Same as I was saying about the snare, I'm gonna try to avoid placing the microphone so that I get this fellow too much. Maybe I could point it from here instead, from underneath. That could also be an option. I could even ask the drummer maybe to lift this cymbal up a little bit. That could help with that kind of thing. Because the hi-hat mic is something that you most of the time would leave on in the mix. Sometimes I would go in and chop them or mute where it doesn't play, but even during hi-hat, that one will be used a lot, so it's important that it doesn't ruin your overheads when having the hi-hat mic engaged. This is a fairly simple drum setup, I would say. Usually, especially for metal, it would look a little bit more complex with stacks of cymbals and different heights and stuff. But my main objective for recording cymbals or drums is to try to capture as much as I can with one solid pair. I usually go with some sort of AB for the overheads, and my main objective is to get as an even cymbal image as possible, where the hi-hat doesn't become an issue and that I don't get too much of the snare drum in there. Even though I can maybe compress and distort away some of the snare drum or duck if I need to, I try to spend some time on the positioning. And I usually tend to try to focus the overheads in a way that it's almost hitting the back sides of the cymbals, both because it would help me get some shells out of the way. It also serves a purpose that if you mic the cymbal like this, it would probably sound the best, like in front, so it projects towards the microphone. But depending on how you hit the cymbal, you would get a lot of these like small transients that could sound like a clip sound almost. By focusing the microphone a little bit more towards the far edge, you already get rid of some of that. In this case, we have a ride cymbal that's actually in the same level as the crashes. And he told me that he uses this as a crash as well, and this as a ride sometimes. So we'll see. Just for sports, I've put up a ride microphone as well. It is possible that I can place this microphone so I don't have to use that one. But something inside me feels a little bit, unrest if I don't have a ride microphone, so I might put that one there. If it's a more complex setup with a lower ride and cymbals just above the ride, then sometimes I would find myself miking the ride from underneath, phase shifting it, and have it as support where needed. We have the KM84's vintage model with the transformers running here for the overheads. That's my starting point anyway. I could use something else, or I could go with the SM81s, which is like cheap Shure microphones that work surprisingly well. I could also use sometimes like ribbons, Coles 4038s, if I'm going for that type of sound. I have a 414 BULS 90s version of the 414, and that one is fairly boring, but it's pretty safe bet for rides. It's seemed to capture the whole ride without too many spikes and resonances in it. So it's a pretty solid choice for that. Sometimes if I need a little bit more focused sound, I might go with the KM84 or something as well. This is probably my favorite room mic configuration. It's a Blumline stereo setup, and that means that we have two figure-8 polo pattern microphones. In this case, it's a 414 EB, which is an old version, brass capsule. They sound nothing like the new ones, I would say. They have a lot of mojo. I put them in figure-8. I haven't padded these actually, because they are at such a distance that it usually works for them. And I try to carefully place them like this in front of the kit. Maybe if I would have a less lively room than this is, I would probably place them a little further away. But since this room has so much return, I'm keeping them fairly close to the drum kit here. And I'm also using them down here quite close to the ground for some different reasons. First, I don't want to have too much cymbals in them. I want more of the shells. Technically speaking, if you have it higher up, you would actually get a little worse low end because of the first return that comes in, and it creates a dip in the lower frequencies. If you would swap the polo patterns here and do like regular XY, it would sound like you're, super boring versus super big. So in addition to the 414s and the Blumline, I have this little bugger, or two of them, one on each side of the room, AB configuration. It's a pressure zone microphone. It's MP30 from Milab, Swedish brand, and it's condenser type. I just place them like this on the floor, and they have a pretty nasty, like mid-ish sound, which usually fits really well into the mix and gives the shell of the drums a nice length without putting too much emphasis on the cymbals. So I will get whatever treble I need from the Blumlines and the 414s, and these I usually just call them my grunge microphones for that reason. Over here I have a real beauty. It's a U67 old vintage Neumann microphone. I'm running this one as a mono microphone for the room in Omni. I tried to keep it pretty far away. This is gonna be like the last sustain of the drums that I sort of need. And I have it a little bit deplaced in the room actually. It's far away, further than the Blumlines. it is in the center line, the complete center line of snare and kick, even though the kick is shooting a little bit off center. I sort of have an idea with this placement. If it would be two of them, I would have to think a little bit different, but with the mono thing here, I want to try to avoid a little bit of the direct from the kick and still have a nice center line from the snare and kick, and also to have all the toms fairly equal in this microphone.